255. Outlaw Social Goals. Chalcedon Report number 194, October 1981. One of the most important aspects of the modern age has been the triumph of what Dostoevsky called underground man. Underground man is not necessarily a lower or middle class man. He can be very wealthy, or a member of the nobility, and even royalty. What all such people have in common is their hostility to and resentment of the established social order. It is the passion of their life to see the faults and evils of that order and to feel a great sympathy for all who are condemned by that society. Is the establishment hostile to criminals, homosexuals, abortion, the sexual revolution, or whatever else it may regard as lawless? Then the outlaw favours all those things. If, as with Henry Miller, who disliked homosexuality apparently and apologised for his disinterest, the outlaw is not in sympathy with one of the forbidden groups, he is unhappy about it. The result of all this is a powerful social force for a variety of causes, a force based on a common hostility to the existing order, whatever it is. The Marxist countries have their own hostile outlaw elements. A telling example of this was Nancy Cunard, daughter of a titled English family. She loathed life. She was in rebellion all her life against her mother, Lady Cunard. Lady Cunard was a poor mother. She disliked motherhood and called it a low thing, the lowest. Nancy set out to shame and disgrace her mother. For her mother's cautious adulteries, she substituted flagrant and open ones. She early had a hysterectomy to give herself more, quote, sexual freedom, end quote. Every cause which would be offensive to her mother's social set, Nancy Cunard despised. She was friendly to the cause of lesbians and homosexuals, anti-Francoism, communism, modern trends in the literary world, and more. She took a black lover to hurt her mother even more, and did her best to indict her mother publicly, because her mother was ready to entertain wealthy Rajas, but not lesser men of another colour. Nancy Cunard became a patron of the arts, a champion of liberal and radical causes, and also an alcoholic and a mental derelict. See Anne Chisholm, Nancy Cunard, 1979. By her own statement, she was at enmity with life, in fulfilment of Proverbs chapter 8, verse 36. All they that hate me love death. Much of the social impetus and action of the modern age has come out of this same outlaw temper. Persons at war with the establishment feel a kinship to every banned or disapproved cause, and they work for the overthrow of the existing order, even to their own destruction. Having said this, we need to recognize a much more ugly fact. The social goals of the outlaw have, at times, overthrown existing customs, laws, and practices, some of which needed overthrowing. Social initiative in the modern age has too often belonged to underground man and his outlaw mentality. It has belonged to him by default, because the Christian Church has either withdrawn from the world into a pietistic retreat into the inner world, or else has, with a guilty conscience and an awareness of its irrelevance, made common cause with the outlaws. In either case, it has been faithless to its Lord and the mandate of Scripture. God's law word is a plan of action for the remaking of all things in conformity to God's righteousness or justice. When John tells us that we are given power to become the sons of God, John chapter 1 verse 12, we must appreciate what these words meant in his day. In the religious mythology of the Roman Empire, the gods, Jupiter and others, often mated with human beings. The results were godlike men of superhuman powers with divine protection. These sons of God were the earth's greatest heroes, the men of action, power, and dominion. It was the greatest compliment to be paid to any man to compare him to the sons of gods, or God. Thus, when the centurion at the crucifixion said literally, "Truly, this man was the Son of God," Mark chapter 15, verse 39, there is no "the" in the original. He spoke out of the context of the Roman world and life view. Jesus, the miracle worker, was, in his eyes, so superhuman a man that he had to be, in the Roman sense, an offspring of some god. Now, when John, inspired of God, declares that we are given by God's adoption of grace the power to be the sons of God, he meant even more than the Romans imagined by that phrase. We become God's dominion men, the people of power, called to occupy till he come. Luke chapter 19, verse 13. Instead of the ineffectual spirit of negation which marks all outlaw social goals, we have God's law word as our plan for dominion. The most that Roman demigods could be was a conqueror, one to whom a triumphal arch was raised. Paul, however, tells us that in Jesus Christ we are more than conquerors. Romans chapter 8, verse 37. We are more than any Roman emperor could dream of being. To return again to the outlaws, the 1960s saw the great American manifestation of a war against the establishment. Clearly, there was much that needed changing, but the rebellious youth was less interested in change than in negation and destruction. Their power to challenge and shake the status quo and the establishment was clearly very, very great, but the youth preferred hostility to constructive action, and their impetus was wasted. A goal of negation winds up being no goal at all. Their stands were a mixture of very conservative and very radical causes, not principles. For example, in World War I, constitutionalists rightly protested the use of drafted troops in foreign wars, since the US Constitution allows only 3 uses for a militia, a drafted military force. 1. To suppress insurrection. 2. Repel invasion. And 3. Enforce the laws of the Union. The Wilson regime subverted the Constitution. The youth of the 1960s had a great opportunity here, but they were not interested in it. At one university after another, I asked the question, are you against the use of draftees in foreign wars as a constitutional principle? Would you oppose using them in both Vietnam and South Africa? Their lack of principles was quickly apparent. A second area of failure was a lack of commitment. Milton Bjorst, in his thoughtful view, with empathy, of the 1960s, sees the end of the movement at Kent State. The issue then became this: were they ready to die for their practices? On these terms, radicalism turned out to have a less committed following than had once been believed. Few were ready to die, and so the decade reached its end. Milton Bjorst, Fire in the Streets, New York, New York, Simon & Schuster, 1979, page 543. The disaster of our time is that Christians are about as uncommitted as the youth of the 1960s. There are signs of a change. Men like Pastor Levi Wisner in Ohio, Dr. Lester Roloff in Texas, and Pastor E. Sullivan in Nebraska have been ready to go to jail for their faith. As I wrote this, Pastor Sullivan was expecting arrest for reopening the Christian school in the Louisville church. Instead, the church had been padlocked. A growing resistance indicates that God is raising up dominion men who will not surrender Christ's domain to the enemy and who are extending the frontiers of his kingdom. The outlaw's social goals are failures. Where the Lord's people move out in his name and power, the gates of hell cannot prevail or hold out against them.